Welcome. If there is one meeting that we get snowed out, the records show, it's the March meeting. So even though we've got some bad weather, apparently we're going to make it. From now on, it's all good. Helen, do you have some announcements?
Simply that Lois asked me if I'd just mention something about next month's meeting, which has to do with the subject of the upcoming exhibition in the museum. It opens on the 7th of April, and it's called The Wildlife Heritage of Clinton County. Mark Gretsch, who is the guest curator of the exhibition, is going to give us our program next month. And it's a fascinating subject. He has spent a lot of time researching the history of animals, birds, fish, how they evolved, what happened to them. Some of them survived, some of them did not, and now it's extinct. He's done a really scholarly job on it, and I think you will enjoy his program very much. Then the exhibition opens about 4 days later, and we'll have a reception at the museum. I hope you'll all come to that. That exhibition runs through October, the end of October. Plenty of time to see it, but I think it's going to be a really good one. Lots of feathered friends in it, by the way, for those who are particularly into birds. The only other thing tonight is membership, and if anybody would like to pick up the membership card, I just happen to have a membership card, and I will be delighted to discuss, not negotiate, but discuss membership with anyone who would like to sign up tonight. And tell you what the levels of membership dues are.
This is turning out to be quite a year for history in the North Country. We have the 175th anniversary of the Battle of Plattsburgh. We have 100 years of State University, New York, Plattsburgh. We have how many years from maneuvers? 50 years for the maneuvers. And Joe McGrath is working on that. Have I got it all?
No, bicentennial of the U.S. Customs.
Bicentennial of the U.S. Customs. So we have a lot of different programs planned here.
200th anniversary of U.S. lighthouses.
That's right, 200th anniversary of U.S. lighthouses. And as you know, we have a lighthouse now we're responsible for that's not 200 years old, but we're still taking advantage of it. So we've got a lot of things coming up during the course of the spring, summer, and fall. Not all museum displays, not all programs, but combinations of all kinds of these different things. Lois, will you introduce our program for tonight?
Well, all of us are touched by Lake Champlain one way or another. Some of us drink it, some of us swim in it, and some boat on it. We all use it if we're going to travel east, because you have to cross over the lake. Tonight our speaker is Charles O'Brien, a native of Burlington, Vermont, and now Associate Professor of History at Clarkson in Potsdam. He'll talk about the historic efforts to construct a Champlain waterway during the 18th and 19th centuries. He'll explore the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological factors which affected the plans for a major commercial link between Lake Champlain and the ocean by way of St. Lawrence River.
As someone raised across the lake, I can add one more bicentennial. Of course, Vermont's bicentennial this year as well. The next thing on my agenda is to get a paper ready for a conference in Montpelier this summer on that subject. So not only Plattsburgh, it's throbbing with historical activity. As Jack and I were talking, while you folks are filing in, Jack asked me what led me to do this work. And I started to tell him, and then I said, well, it's part of my talk anyway, so I didn't tell him. I said, well, it said I'm from Burlington, and I travel to Burlington a lot to see friends and family. was about 3.5 years ago. I was held up, as I imagine a lot of you folks were, for the construction for the new bridge. And as my car was cleared to move and I started to reach about 30 miles an hour, suddenly this thought went through my mind. I said to myself, well, once that bridge is finished, there'll never be a Champlain Waterway. And I just about slammed on the brakes and caused an accident right on the spot, because it flashed through my mind that no one had ever studied this waterway, which I knew had been proposed as early as the early 1780s by Ira Allen, and then I myself was in Burlington in the 50s and 60s when it was much discussed. And I thought, here may be something to look into, and I was working at UVM the next day anyway on another project, and just started browsing around in their materials, and I found this unmined vein of ore. And that was 3.5 years ago, and that's more or less what I've been doing. I've written a couple of papers on it. I have a third that I'll do after the Bicentennial Conference paper for Vermont this summer. And even since that moment that flashed through my mind 3.5 years ago, the waterway, or a potential waterway, has come to mind in connection with the Free Trade Trust that was still pretty far down the road 3.5 years ago, and here we are. The present day Free Trade Trust is the third or fourth. We did have pretty free trade with the Canadians in the 1780s and 90s, if only because there was no one around to stop the trade. And then in the 1840s, particularly the 50s, we had a formal agreement with the Canadians from 1854 to 1866. In 1911, we negotiated a free trade agreement, which the Canadians wanted to ratify finally. And then, of course, the famous free trade events of 1988. Tonight's lecture will focus, as Lois said, on the military, economic, and political factors, which are the predominant ones in the 18th and 19th century. The 20th century story of the waterway is a paper I just finished and mailed off within the last month, early February. Is dominated by the changing role of the Champlain Valley, and I'm sure many of the people present have lived through that and witnessed the changes in the valley. I mean, I'm just a spring chicken of almost 50, and I've witnessed plenty of them with the sack face and the high-tech complex around Burlington and the recreational values of the lake, and of course, above all, the environmental movement. But that's another story. The possibility of using Lake Champlain as a link in a waterway that would join the Hudson, the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence, and ultimately the high seas was proposed as early as 1783. In the 2 centuries since, many attempts were made, the last in the mid-1960s. Construction of a new bridge at Rouse's Point with a clearance of only 55 feet, completed in the fall of 1987, would seem to have ended once and for all the dreams of salties in Lake Champlain. In assessing the many efforts to make Lake Champlain a major waterway, one must consider an extremely intricate set of circumstances: geological, geographical, military, political, economic, technological, and environmental. One simple and accurate way to look at the failure to construct the waterway is to note that its supporters were never able to align these factors in a positive way. And perhaps I should stop for a moment and point out a curiosity to the nature of this work and the nature of this talk, and that we're talking about a canal that wasn't built. It's sort of a rare thing to do in history, talk about something that wasn't done. We usually talk about something that was done. But I think given the short distance between the north end of Lake Champlain and the St. Lawrence, the fact that a significant river runs that short distance anyway and just needed to be deepened. It is a relevant historical question to ask why not. And that's what I attempted to explore in these two papers, the thrust of one you'll hear tonight. When economic aspects may have been favorable, political and military aspects were unfavorable. This was probably the case between 1783 and 1865, when Canadian-American relations were dominated by considerable hostility. After the Civil War, as railroads became dominant, the economics of most inland waterways were dubious at best, and the highly protectionist economic policies of both the Canadians and the Americans were hardly conducive to encouraging more north-south trade. Although this talk will consider all of these factors, it is most appropriate to begin, as the lake itself began, with geology. At first glance, the geological setting of Lake Champlain seems highly favorable for its development as a major waterway. Its north-south orientation means that it lies with the grain of the major rivers and mountains of eastern North America. As has often been noted, the predominant east-west development of most North American transportation systems has defied both nature and the public purse. Indeed, when urging British cooperation in building a canal to the St. Lawrence and decrying lack of American support for the project, Levi Allen wrote the Lieutenant Governor of Lower Canada in 1797. While the state of New York is attempting rapes on the works of nature, the inhabitants of this province will not so much as clear out the obstructions in her natural channels. What Allen was referring to were the beginning efforts of New York to build a canal at the south end of the lake, which Allen and his brothers and other residents of this area regarded as a much more difficult prospect, as indeed it was. And the reference to clearing out obstructions in her natural channels is the set of shoals and whatnot around the city of St. John, Quebec. In the glacial age, Lake Champlain drained south into the Hudson. If present conditions continue, it will one day drain south again. The difference between north and south drainage involves a mere 12-inch tilt in the lake bed. Add to this the fact that the lake is only about 92 feet above sea level, that a sizable river already connects it to the St. Lawrence, and one can readily see that no great feats of engineering would be required to build a waterway. The major geological obstacles are rock formations lying below the only possible routes. And I might add that these rock formations are child's play compared to the kinds of things that engineers faced in the International Rapid section of the St. Lawrence Seaway. All of the major engineering studies made in connection with the Champlain waterway concluded that the idea was technologically feasible, even for a deep waterway. The reasons for the failure to construct the waterway lie elsewhere. A major negative element was the hostile military relationship which pertained between the United States and its northern neighbor until the latter part of the 19th century. Lake Champlain had served as the most important north-south invasion route from the early years of the French regime to the War of 1812. Given hostile relations, it is almost axiomatic that the weaker side would see improved water transport as a threat. This, in large part, is what actually happened. During the early years of the 19th century, the British had the upper hand, and the Americans were wary of making improvements. After the War of 1812, the situation was rapidly reversed. The first notable supporter of what he termed a ship canal was Ira Allen. Showing the Champlain Valley patriotism that so marked his family, Allen attempted to exploit troubled Anglo-American relations to the benefit of the residents of the valley and his own extensive family. He lobbied long and hard in London on behalf of the ship canal and of a vision of the Champlain region as a neutral commercial entrepot. For example, he attempted to persuade the Duke of Portland, Home Secretary in the government of William Pitt the Younger, that if the canal were built, the British may avail themselves of the very important advantage in times of war
of shipping their goods to and from Canada secure of capture in the neutral vessels of Vermont, and the government will be free to employ the ships of war otherwise necessary for convoy on other urgent services. The British turned a deaf ear to Allen's arguments, and after the War of 1812, directed enormous energies into building an east-west system of canals which would be secure from American attack. I'm thinking specifically of the Rideau Canal, running anywhere between about 20 and 50 miles from the American border in its long course. The most notable military historian of Canadian canals, George Roudsons, wrote, "For the military, the lesson of the war years was that if the Americans attacked again, nothing beyond Montreal could be defended without new water communications." Despite these fears, the British found the Champlain route useful during the Canadian Rebellion of 1837, when the ship Burlington was chartered from the Lake Champlain Transportation Company to ferry government troops from Saint Jean, Quebec, to the rear of rebel troops at Napierville, Quebec. 12 years later, Lower Canada chartered a company to build a deep water canal, and in the terms of the charter, reserved exclusive use of the canal for the transport of Her Majesty's forces, should the legislature deem it expedient. This charter was issued on May 30th of 1849 and served as the focal point of a convention of interested parties held from both sides of the border, held at Saratoga Springs the following August. The American participants at Saratoga were primarily Champlain Valley merchants and Troy shipping interests. The chief concern of the Troy people was to use the canal to resist the expansion of railroads, which they regard as a death sentence for Troy. Major reservations were expressed at the Saratoga Convention by the Americans in terms of the language of the charter, this business of exclusive use for Her Majesty's forces. The fear of the Americans was that the canal would give the Royal Navy access to Lake Champlain. Reassurances given by the Canadians were sufficient to gain unanimous endorsement of a report urging a deep water canal. As American power grew, however, in the mid-19th century, fear of a British fleet in Lake Champlain was replaced by a desire on the part of some Americans to have the capacity to put an American fleet in the St. Lawrence. Reminded of the remark of the late Israeli General Moshe Dayan that in the midst of the 73 war, that after the initial Syrian success, Dayan said we were going to show the Syrians that the road from Damascus to Tel Aviv also runs from Tel Aviv to Damascus. That the Richelieu River also runs from Lake Champlain to the St. Lawrence. This attitude underlay several resolutions that were passed during the Civil War by the New York State Legislature in hopes of influencing Congress to build a canal. The state engineer and surveyor of New York were directed to examine the Champlain Canal with a view to enlarging the same to a sufficient capacity for the passage of gunboats through Lake Champlain, thereby connecting the tidewaters of the Hudson with the St. Lawrence. These gunboats could also pass down the river, the Richelieu, to the St. Lawrence and thus aid in breaking the chain of water communication between Lower and Upper Canada. Our colonial, our revolutionary, and our national history each testify to the importance and danger of this old and very natural warpath. This attitude was part of the deliberations surrounding the Champlain Waterway as late as 1897. In that year, the Corps of Engineers objected to a Champlain-St. Lawrence route on several grounds. A major study was done in 1897. Most were economic. However, at the very end of the report, the engineers concluded that such a route would be seriously exposed to hostile attacks in the event of war with Canada, and thus would be in a high degree objectionable from a military standpoint. Much of the military argumentation seems to have had a political and economic motive as well. It's hard to believe that anyone thought seriously of war between Canada and the United States as late as 1897. For example, the very sentence that I just quoted from the 1897 report adds further in the sentence as an additional objection. It, meaning the canal, would tend to increase Canadian commerce. And I think that's the key to the engineer's report in 1897. It concluded that Canadian commerce would benefit more than American commerce, and just tossed in the military objection as just one more stone to add to the pile. Politics, likewise, were part and parcel of every effort to promote or defeat waterway initiatives. Ira Allen's original proposal was conceived as part of a larger campaign to keep this area independent of both New York and New Hampshire by establishing links to Canada, and in the course of so doing, make more valuable the extensive Allen family land holdings in northern Vermont. Allen's first proposal was made in 1784 to Governor General Haldeman at a time when the status of this part of the world, particularly the other side of the lake, was unsettled to say the least. Haldeman thought enough of the idea to have part of the proposed route surveyed, and in the sheet that I handed out, the route we're talking about is Route C. Ira Allen's original proposal called for the waterway to go down the Richelieu to these shoals at St. John, take an abrupt turn to the west across the La Prairie Basin, and enter the St. Lawrence near Caughnawaga. That remained, even in the 20th century, a viable proposal. Although as time went on, the common sense route that I think anyone picking up that sheet would come to, and it'd be easier to go straight down Richelieu to Sorel. Allen and his brothers had a vision of the Champlain Valley as a neutral buffer between Canada and the United States. As late as 1797, Ira was seeking British support for neutral territory comprised of Vermont and the northeast portion of New York, including the entire west shore of Lake Champlain. He envisioned a second such territory in western New York, contiguous to Lake Erie. This position, presented privately to the Duke of Portland, was repeated as part of a public lobbying effort in an open letter to London merchants. Allen's efforts were followed by similar activities on the part of other pro-waterway American lobbyists in London in the late 1790s. Samuel Peters in 1797 and John Graham in 1798. At the same time, Ira's brother Levi, citing his somewhat dubious loyalist past, was importuning the government of Lower Canada on behalf of the canal. Although attachment to the British cause may have been a deceptive claim on the part of Levi Allen, Samuel Peters had excellent loyalist credentials. He had been an Anglican clergyman in Connecticut during the early stages of the Revolution, where he incurred the special attention of the Sons of Liberty and subsequently fled to England. Peters was living on a small British pension when he was selected by a group of Vermont Episcopalians as Bishop of Vermont. When his name came before the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Archbishop declined to consecrate Peters on the grounds that by that late date, such matters were an entirely American concern. In fact, the Anglican Episcopate had been established in the U.S. several years before. Peters claimed that 7/10 of the settlers in this region, and in the Genesee country, the second piece of territory they wanted as a neutral buffer, were loyal to the House of Hanover during the American War, and that their inclusion within the United States by the Treaty of Paris was, quote, contrary to their wishes. According to Peters, The people of the area are dissatisfied with Mr. Jay's treaties, which permits them to go down by water to Quebec or Montreal and no farther. By this maneuver of Mr. Jay, he intends that the people of this area shall go overland 75 miles to Albany with their exports and imports, that New York may be the emporium for Vermont. Peters termed Montreal the natural emporium for the area, a concept that figured prominently in the work of John Graham, the third lobbyist in London at the same time. Graham was a lawyer from Rutland, Vermont. Graham complained bitterly of the arduous trip to the Hudson for the products of the Champlain Valley. He called it a journey that consumes half the profits of the area. The more natural northern route, he said, would, to the great advantage of both countries, in a navigation of 15 to 18 miles, enable them to receive goods from the bosom of the Thames into Lake Champlain. The British response to these overtures ranged from evasive to negative. Ira Allen later claimed that Portland and Pitt were in favor of granting such ship canal as being interesting to the mercantile interests of Great Britain. In a letter to Governor Galusha and the Vermont legislature in 1809, Allen said that in 1796, London bankers and merchants had assured him that shares in any canal company would be sold in a week. The available evidence belies Allen's intention. There's no clear evidence of British support, and several significant indications of disinterest or opposition. The Duke of Portland, for example, was concerned that a better link to the south would help disseminate Republican principles in Lower Canada and Upper Canada. Allen sought to allay these fears and replied that, in his opinion, the effect of a canal would be wholly to frustrate Republican design by tying the area more closely to British interests. It's also clear from Allen's correspondence at this time that the so-called ship canal proposal aroused considerable opposition in some London commercial circles. The Duke of Portland, for his part, seems to have engaged in classic bureaucratic resistance. According to Allen, the Duke at first objected to any share of the expense on the part of the British government, but expressed a willingness to hear proposals for a canal financed otherwise. However, 6 months later, when he delivered Britain's negative decision, the Duke told Allen that if such a canal were ever built, it would have to be entirely British. John Graham, who heard the same message, accounted for the cool reception on the ground that the pressure of more weighty affairs, no doubt, prevented His Grace from giving that consideration to the business, which perhaps he otherwise would have done. Levi Allen came closer to the point when he observed, with respect to his efforts in Lower Canada, through His Excellency's multiplicity of business, the canal was omitted, or other reasons unknown. Pent-up resentment at British indifference was evident when Ira Allen received the final negative verdict in August of 1796. I observed that I should have been much obliged to His Grace to have told me that at my first interview, and not kept me a dancing attendance 5 or 6 months for such an answer, and immediately withdrew. Ira Allen died in 1814, on the eve of the great surge of North American canal building. The Erie Canal was begun in 1817, completed in 1823, and had a dramatic impact on the ports of Albany and New York City. The aggressive attitude of New York extended north to Lake Champlain as well. A shallow draft canal between the Hudson and Lake Champlain was finished in 1823. In urging the construction of this canal, the New York Canal Commissioners inverted almost precisely the arguments advanced by Ira Allen and his associates 20 years earlier. They said that the products of the Champlain country would find a profitable sale along the Hudson and in the city of New York, instead of being driven, as many of those articles hitherto have been, to a precarious market by long and hazardous navigation to Quebec. the new Champlain Canal, would divert from the province of Lower Canada and turn to the south the profits of the trade of Lake Champlain. The commissioners' hopes were realized, but on a much smaller scale than they had anticipated. The era in which canals played a dominant role in the United States transportation system was relatively short. Highly favorable auspices for a canal from Lake Champlain to the St. Lawrence existed between 1815 and 1828. Unfortunately, for the promoters of the canal, the violent reaction of Canada to the War of 1812 proved a major obstacle. Canadian energies were directed toward an east-west canal governed by military considerations rather than a north-south canal governed by commercial considerations. The election of 1828 brought to power in the United States Andrew Jackson and an assortment of Jacksonians who for more than a generation opposed federal government spending on so-called internal improvements. This was political opposition on a far more profound level. Two major statements suffice to drive home the point. Jackson's famous veto of the Maysville Road Bill in 1830, a road that was to run across the state of Kentucky, which Jackson vetoed on the basis that since it was entirely in Kentucky, it wasn't in interstate commerce and the federal government had no business paying anything for it, despite the fact that the reality of the road was to open up a huge area of the West. And a veto message by President Polk, called in the history books Young Hickory, as opposed to Old Hickory. In 1847, Polk told Congress that to regulate commerce does not mean to make a road, or dig a canal, or clear out a river, or deepen a harbor. If government performed such functions, said Polk, the true interests of the country would be lost sight of in an annual scramble for the contents of the treasury. Jacksonian opposition to public expenditure on major projects was especially important because it coincided with a number of developments which otherwise were very favorable for a waterway, and which, given a supportive governmental attitude, might well have carried the day. The triumph of the free trade movement in Britain in the 1840s had the effect of drastically increasing Canadian-American economic links. In 1849, a group of Montreal merchants launched an annexation movement to join the United States as the ultimate response to being thrown overboard by the British when the British repealed the various imperial preferences on Canadian grain and things of that sort, the repeal of the Corn Laws. At the same time, the completion in 1843 of the Champlain Canal opened the Richelieu River to navigation. The new canal, with a depth of 6.5 feet, permitted the passage of shallow draft barges from Lake Champlain to the St. Lawrence. This wasn't the ship canal for high seas vessels which Ira Allen had dreamed about, but it was as close to fulfillment as that dream was ever to come. That there was a realistic base to Allen's proposals can be seen in the dramatic impact of the Champlain Canal on Lake Champlain trade. Within 3 years, the value of lake commerce increased 11-fold. In the next 2 years, 1846 to 1848, this higher level of trade in turn doubled. And this is before the Reciprocity Treaty of 1854. Burlington, in particular, was the beneficiary of increased commerce. An additional factor favoring waterway construction in these years was, ironically, the completion of a rail link between Burlington and Boston in 1849. Historically, railroads and canals have been fierce antagonists. In the 20th century, both the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Champlain Waterway were fought bitterly by rail interests. You people here in Plattsburgh probably have been exposed to an awful lot of Delaware and Hudson propaganda over the years in connection with these waterways. Railroads offered speed, reliability, and a 12-month shipping season. They were soon to displace canals as the primary mode of freight transport. It is no surprise then that those interested in promoting trade on a St. Lawrence, Champlain, Hudson route saw a dire threat in the Central Vermont Railway and moved energetically to meet it. The next step for the growing rail system, after the link to Burlington was completed, was to be a bridge across Lake Champlain at Rouse's Point, the same bridge that Rouse's Point people are proud to call the largest fishing pier in the world or something like that, as we look at its decaying timbers these days. Such a bridge was regarded as a death sentence for northern trade by Troy shippers, who saw their profits being lost to a Montreal-Boston rail route. A major campaign was launched to block the bridge and at the same time to advance the cause of an improved waterway. A pamphleteer calling himself a Vermonter, who was an anonymous Burlington merchant, argued in a lengthy article published in October of 1848 that it was much more advantageous for Montreal merchants to trade with the United States via Lake Champlain than any other route. Circumstances were favorable for vastly increased trade. Burlington must be the eastern Buffalo and derive much prosperity from this new and extensive trade, said the Vermonter. Montreal's imports from Britain were declining, while purchases from the United States were rising rapidly. The folly of the railroad bridge could be shown from the fact that the timbers for existing rail bridges had been shipped not by rail, but by water on the Chambly Canal and Lake Champlain. The Vermonter saw Burlington as a major port as well as a rail terminus. The bridge at Rouse's Point carried the threat that Burlington would be bypassed, while in any canal system, the city would be central. Let the Champlain and St. Lawrence Canal be built. Throw open the American and Canadian markets to each other's products and manufactures upon terms of reciprocity. Secure the free navigation of Canadian waters. And from that moment, both countries would derive incalculable benefit from a commerce which would otherwise be lost. This pamphlet was part of an orchestrated campaign on behalf of a new waterway, one intended to follow closely Ira Allen's original route. In May of 1849, a Canadian firm was granted a charter to build such a canal. And it's in August of that year, following up on this charter, that the meeting in Saratoga that I mentioned in connection with the military factors took place. The group in a meeting in Saratoga Springs gave themselves the name Deep Waterway Convention and published a favorable cost-benefit analysis, as well as paying for the first detailed engineering report on the waterway. The cost of construction of a deep canal from St. Jean to Caughnawaga was estimated at $2,084,000. F.X. Claxton, the engineer making the report, told the convention that the actual cost would probably be 10 to 20% less, but he just wanted to be safe. He probably couldn't pave a mile of Plattsburgh streets for $2 million. The American delegates produced a report demonstrating the economic superiority of the Champlain-St. Lawrence route over the Erie Canal. In fact, even without an improved waterway, in 1849, a grain barge arrived in Burlington from Toledo, Ohio, via the St. Lawrence-Chambly canal route, with a charge of 15.5 cents per bushel, at a time when the comparable rate on the Erie Canal was 26 cents a bushel. In the nearly 200-year history of attempts to build the Champlain waterway, the period between 1840 and 1860 was probably the apogee of favorable indicators. With the reciprocity agreement of 1854, the economic advantages just cited, and positive diplomatic relations at long last with Great Britain, most of the earlier obstacles had been cleared. Why then was the waterway not built? The fundamental answer to this question is that canals were overtaken by railroads in terms of transportation technology and, at least as important, political influence. Although the prevailing reluctance to use public funds for such projects is also important. By rail, New York, Boston, and Philadelphia could be reached from Montreal in less than 12 hours. Using the proposed St. Lawrence Waterway, it would take between 7 and 10 days. By 1860, the Erie Canal was in deep financial difficulty. New York State's Champlain Canal, this gets a little confusing, you sometimes see it referred to as the Northern Canal, which shows the perspective of the state on the matter. As far as the Erie Canal was concerned, it was the Northern Canal. As far as you and I are concerned, the Champlain Valley people, it's the south end of the lake. But it's safest, I guess, just to call it the Champlain Canal, although you will occasionally see it referred to as the Northern Canal, but it means the south end of the lake. Northern only in relation to Albany. This canal lost money steadily, accumulating a deficit which reached $5.5 million by the end of the century. The Canadian Charter, which had been the subject of the Saratoga Springs meeting in 1849, expired after one renewal, while the reciprocity arrangements ended in 1866. Protectionism on both sides of the border was the order of the day for almost 50 years, a circumstance hardly propitious for expenditure on a major new commercial link. Nevertheless, the dream lived on. When negotiations were undertaken in 1868 in a vain attempt to revive reciprocity, Governor Page of Vermont insisted that American negotiators demand a clause in any new agreement that would require Canada to build a Champlain ship canal. These negotiations were not fruitful. We continued to have trade war with our northern neighbors for the next 50 years, although a new charter was issued to a new Canadian corporation in 1870. A result of this new charter was a trip to Boston by a substantial delegation from the Champlain Valley, led by Governor Levi Underwood of Vermont and John Young, a Montreal financier who was the Canadian most responsible for the charter. The Boston Board of Trade hosted a meeting which included Governor Fairchild of Wisconsin, who was there to lobby for support for waterway development in his state, which he hoped would be combined with the Champlain-St. Lawrence route and link Wisconsin to eastern markets via the Champlain Canal and break the lock that the Erie system had on the development of the Midwest. And that was Fairchild's agenda. The 30-page proceedings of this meeting show clearly that the principle which brought the participants together was the common desire to develop an alternative to the Great Lakes, Buffalo, Erie, Hudson route. A significant link in this alternative was the rail system in northern Vermont. Bear in mind that the Delaware and Hudson didn't get up here until 1876, a couple years later. The waterway and the rail system would complement one another, said Governor Underwood. I do not come here for the purpose of making any assault upon railroad transportation. Railroads are an absolute necessity. There is a certain class of product that cannot afford to be transported by rail. It must come by water. There are some descriptions of good that must go by rail because speed is of the utmost importance. Water transportation is just as necessary to railway communication as railway transportation is necessary to water communication. The new waterway would offer Boston the advantage of grain shipment to within 234 miles without breaking bulk. Grain would then be offloaded at Burlington and shipped throughout New England by rail. The time required to ship grain from Chicago to Burlington would be less than that from Buffalo to Albany on the Erie Canal, according to Underwood. Not only was it quicker and easier, but the proposed new route was through water of lower temperature, a crucial factor in reducing damage to grain. Spoilage on the Erie Canal, he said, was so large that there are dealers at Albany and also at Buffalo whose business it is to buy damaged grain. In addition, the St. Lawrence Champlain route had a navigation season 21 days longer on average between 1848 and 1868 than the Erie Canal. Underwood's remarks were seconded by John Young and E.H. Derby. The latter, speaking on behalf of the railroads of New England, said he wished to welcome this ship canal, now presented as an acquisition to the railroad world. It is not a railroad, but a feeder to railroads. The effect of the canal would be to create at Burlington another Albany. The plan to carry Champlain into the waters of the St. Lawrence. Now, what is this Lake Champlain? Why, it has been a canal from time immemorial, the best of canals on account of its width and its placid waters. So placid that in the time of the French wars, before our fathers reached the interior of the country, the French and Indians came up in their bateaux, in their birch canoes, to Ticonderoga and Whitehall, and so invaded this section. But, sir, instead of an invasion, we will have treasure floating in by the argosies of the canal. Underwood carried his campaign to Washington in 1874, co-authoring a long memorial to Senator William Windom, chairman of the Senate Committee on Transportation. In place of the economic arguments made at Boston, Underwood's focus was on the inadequacy of the water supply of the Erie Canal to sustain increased capacity. He contrasted the rich supply of water available to a Champlain route with the problems encountered by the Erie Canal on the 90-mile level stretch between Rome and Syracuse. If there is not enough water to feed the present Erie Canal to the capacity of a boat of 200 tons, drawn by slow horsepower, how can this same water supply feed a canal for boats of 500 tons propelled by steam? Underwood and his co-author, Smith Weed, also directed their attention to the foreign relations aspect of the Champlain waterway. Noting that one of their main antagonists, New York Canal interests, have denounced any route that entered foreign soil, they attempted to turn this aspect of the Champlain route into an asset. Fear of Canadian participation in building a canal, they argued, was a policy too narrow for a statesman. Canadian involvement in the project was not a liability. Nothing would be more powerful to cement the two people in terms of amity than mutual commercial convenience. This Canadian charter of the 1870s also resulted in a new feasibility study prepared by a noted civil engineer named Walter Shanley, who had been closely associated with the engineers who had made the 1848 survey. Shanley estimated a cost of $5.5 million for a canal, which would match the dimensions of the improved Welland Canal in Canada, the crucial point being a depth of 12 feet. However, Shanley's own preference was for a canal 10 feet deep. I believe one of the reasons was that in the slate shoals and whatnot that run off the two shores of Lake Champlain have a clearance of 10 feet. So a 10-foot canal required doing nothing to the bed of Lake Champlain. Such a canal, Shanley asserted, was entirely adequate and considerably less expensive. His estimate for a canal with a channel 10 feet deep was $4,250,000. Implicit in the Shanley report was a significant shift in the nature of the proposed waterway. A canal with a 10-foot depth was not, by 1874, a true seaway, not the link to the open sea envisioned by Ira Allen. The size and draft of salties changed greatly over the years. A draft of 12 feet was about the minimum for a salty in 1874. Later, advocates of a true seaway would urge depths of 27, 30, 36, and even 41 feet. Shanley's report represents the starting point of a division within the ranks of waterway advocates between seaway partisans and supporters of a, quote, improved barge canal. That's a division that's more important for the 20th century story, but let me just pause for a minute and point out some of the implications of the two positions. The improved barge canal it has a North American focus. That is, a depth of 12 feet would be congruent with the major Canadian canals, with the Erie Canal, with the Champlain Canal at the south end of the state, and was kind of the secret agenda of Senator George Aiken in the 50s and 60s. Aiken, I think I can show pretty clearly, played ball with the deep sea people, the seaway people, but he didn't really want a Champlain seaway himself, despite often saying that he did. I think that it's pretty clear that that was not really what he wanted. Obviously, the deeper depths mean you're talking about bringing ocean freighters into Lake Champlain. And when you factor in the environmental movement of the 1960s, there's hardly anyone who could be found that wanted to see freighters in Lake Champlain. Some people did argue that a 12-foot improved barge canal was consistent with environmental values, but most people wouldn't even go that far. Shanley contended that for both Lake Champlain and the Great Lakes, transshipment from large vessels to barges would be the rule. River navigation never can be improved to the capacity of the lake, and sailing masters will not throw away the advantage of 2, 3, or 4 feet draft that lake navigation will allow as compared with the river, merely that they may pass clear through to Montreal or Quebec, or odd times to Liverpool. Shanley's proposed route followed the 1848 route, which in turn closely resembled Ira Allen's original suggestion. Its terminus was the St. Lawrence at Caughnawaga rather than Sorel. The superiority of this route over any existing east-west link to New England was simply an incontestable proposition, Shanley argued. Montreal would come to dominate trade in the area, and the fears of the city's merchant community that New York City would be the chief beneficiary of the Champlain Canal were senseless and unreasoning. The commerce in question, Shanley pointed out, was not existing commerce, which Montreal stood to lose. It was new trade, which would be generated by the Waterway. Decrying the lack of public support for the venture, he closed his report with a note which reflected the chagrin of many late 19th century advocates of inland water transport. Millions for railways, not 1 cent for navigation, would not inaptly characterize what has been our policy. Shanley was certainly correct in indicating that the prevailing wind was opposed to new canals. The factors militating against a major new waterway were far too strong for a small group of Canadians and Champlain Valley residents to overcome. The Corps of Engineers of the U.S. Army issued its first formal report on the waterway in 1875. C.A. Fuller, the engineer making the report, accepted the cost estimate put forward by Mills and Shanley, whose work he praised highly. However, he found New York's Champlain Canal at the south end of the lake so unsatisfactory that he recommended construction of a new canal. The estimated cost for the United States portion of the new waterway then soared to a discouraging $11,153,000. The enthusiasm of Boston rail interests, evident in 1870, waned after the completion of the Delaware and Hudson line in 1876 made Albany and New York likely beneficiaries of a water link to the St. Lawrence. Added to these negative indicators was the ferocious opposition of politically powerful New York. Opposition powerful enough to deter serious consideration of a Champlain waterway for another 20 years. However, by the 1890s, the spectacular economic growth of the upper Midwest was the catalyst for one final consideration of a deep canal before the turn of the century. Exploitation of the Mesabi ore deposits brought an undreamed volume of traffic to the Great Lakes. Existing railroads and canals seemed to many observers to be incapable of meeting the new demands. Supporters of the St. Lawrence Champlain route saw another opportunity to pursue their hopes. One such supporter was Thomas H. Canfield, a Burlington merchant in the 1840s and a participant in the Saratoga Convention. Like many Vermonters, Canfield had migrated to the Midwest. He had had a successful career in railroading, including a major role in the construction of the Northern Pacific. Almost a half-century after leaving Burlington, Canfield returned to address the city's business community on the subject of a deep waterway. The development of the Midwest meant that conditions were even more favorable for a ship canal than they had been in 1849, said Canfield. Can we go on taking care of this immense, rapidly increasing traffic with even a channel 14 feet deep? Or shall we have a deeper one that can carry about 4 times as much with the same crew and outfit? These are the facts we have to consider, and the business which must be provided for. It is a condition and not a theory which confronts us. Canfield's idea of a deep waterway was a canal which could float ocean-going vessels carrying 10,000 tons. Canfield was part of a large-scale lobbying effort, which was led by Senator Edmunds of Vermont. Hopes were high when Edmunds succeeded in getting the Champlain route considered as part of a Corps of Engineers study of a proposed ship canal from the Great Lakes to the Hudson River. The focus of the study was the Erie route, with the St. Lawrence Champlain alternative occupying a distinctly secondary position. Unfortunately for Edmunds, Canfield, and their allies, the Corps in 1897 was at least as hostile to the idea of a new waterway as it had been in 1875. It rejected the idea of a deep canal along the Erie route as prohibitively expensive and came down squarely in favor of simply improving barge traffic. As far as the Champlain-St. Lawrence route was concerned, the report took the position that American sovereignty was a necessary precondition for any construction. This left 2 alternatives, and you can trace them on the handout. The first was a completely unfeasible route from the St. Lawrence near Messina to Lake Champlain near Rouse's Point, keeping just south of the existing border. It doesn't even show up as one of the routes that were considered. That Xerox, by the way, is from an illustration from Vermont Life in 1958. They gave me permission to copy it. The second alternative was to secure the cession of sufficient Canadian territory to allow a route very close to Ira Allen's original proposal, Route C on your illustration, to be within United States territory. It is suggested that no consideration should be given to a ship canal by this route except upon condition that the St. Lawrence be made the boundary as far as the route lies in it, and that the territory south of the St. Lawrence and west of the Richelieu River, and within, say, 10 miles of the canal, be ceded absolutely to the United States, thus locating the entire route within American territory and without any limiting or awkward treaty stipulations of any kind. Well, there was fat chance the Canadians would vote for that. Also, I think it's worth noting that we're talking about a report in 1897, and it was only 3 years later, in 1904, that the Panama Canal Zone was erected, and the same 10-mile zone was included there. As I mentioned earlier, when I was considering military factors, the Corps also found this route highly objectionable from a military standpoint. I would say the Corps' objections were hardly based on engineering. In fact, the most damning point in the eyes of those making this report was that foreign registry vessels, especially British and Canadian, would benefit more than American ships. The report favored improvements on existing canals and concluded that the Champlain-St. Lawrence route should not be considered by the United States. On this seemingly definitive note, more than a century of grand dreams and hard work ended. When the project was revived in the 20th century, it was under such vastly different circumstances. The Depression, World War II, the St. Lawrence Seaway, the environmental movement of the 1960s, as to require a separate study. As far as the 18th and 19th century is concerned, the history of the Champlain Waterway was dominated by the presence at all times of at least one prohibiting factor. A favorable configuration of the major elements, economic, military, political, and technological, was necessary. On several occasions, 3 of these were present, but never all 4. In this sense, the Champlain Waterway was an idea whose time never came. Be glad to answer questions or hear comments from people. Is there anyone here who attended the hearings that were held in Plattsburgh in the 60s? Oh, great.
It was interesting at the time, my own perception was that the hearing commission had made up its mind that they were holding the hearing only because the law said they had to. I made an objection based upon possibility of oil spills and brought photographs of the oil spills that had already come on Cumberland Head at that time. There was no impact of that on those people at all, as far as I could see.
What's your name, sir?
Grover.
I've read the transcripts of those hearings, so I've probably read your testimony.
And as a result, we were given the opportunity to get free the reports of the study. But when I put my name in to get one, they said, "You probably don't want one, it's too technical." That's a challenge. I said, "Yes, I do." I read them all through and I did not find them very difficult. And the thing that stood out that I gathered from the report, the main reason it was not recommended again was the economic. European interests would profit more than the United States.
Well, yeah, probably it's not proper to have a discussion on the paper it didn't give. Talking about the canal that wasn't built in the paper that wasn't given. But I can make a couple of comments. First, I've interviewed Charles Ross, who was one of the IJC commissioners, and I'm sure he would say that his mind was still open at that point. But there is a factor in that the board appointed its own Champlain Waterway feasibility group, and they submitted a report in 1965. I think the hearing we're talking about took place in '66. I'm positive of that. So that, in that sense, it's not that they're necessarily that their minds were made up, but I think you're also right in suggesting that the hearings, to a certain extent, were ex post facto. I believe the waterway was dead. And if it had been a live issue, more hotly contested, in fact, maybe the others of you who heard the hearing could bear me out on this point, but I remember reading in the transcripts that the chairman of the hearing, former Congressman Tino Roncalio, said at one point, in the face of all the negative testimony that the body heard that day, he said in exasperation, "Now someone, somewhere must have wanted this waterway or we wouldn't be here." It was a surprise to at least Roncalio that the constituency that was expected to support the waterway turned out not to want it, people like yourself. Any comments on the paper I did give?
I understood you to say that Smith Weed was behind one of those projects, which puzzles me since he's also behind the D&H.
Now that would be a puzzle to me too.
I think
Well,
that
the
was
D&H
tied.
at one time was the canal company first,
Yeah.
and the railroad second.
Well, wouldn't the D&H have been able to ship coal to the Midwest?
By
The Adirondack ore that was available at that time was very important, and he was I think, president of the Chateauguay Iron Company at the time, and the shipping it abroad might have been quite appealing, but that was long before Masabi. The high quality of the Adirondack ore probably played a role in his interest.
There's certainly no question that by the IJC held a major hearing in the mid-30s, and then this long series that lasted from 63. It actually submitted its report in 67. So there were two big rounds before the IJC, and the Delaware and Hudson was brutal in its opposition to the Waterway on both of those occasions. They saw no.
I'm sure you read a lot from General Burton Fay on his testimony, etc. He, of course, was tied in with the railroad very heavily, and the Delaware and Hudson and so on, and anything that suggested competition there was intolerable. He certainly was a key member there in the 60s and a lot of the communication.
Yeah, this third paper that I contemplate writing in a year or so, I'm hopefully going to get a Fulbright appointment to Morocco for next year and be booked. I'm going to hear about that in a week or so, but I want to write a paper on focusing only on the 60s story and focusing largely on the Lake Champlain Committee. And you could not get the pro-Waterway people ever to agree that D&H was not behind the Lake Champlain Committee.
Well, they were.
Well, that's not what some of the...
Well, I know the promoters from Albany on the D&H and so on.
Yeah.
At the time. There's no question about it.
Well, like funding it?
Yes.
Well, I got to interview you. Because I haven't seen it. All those allegations were made. I've interviewed Peter Payne, who was the counsel for the Champlain Committee at these hearings.
He came late on that one.
And he also was the son of...
Excuse me for saying that, but
he was the son of a D&H officer, but Peter insists vigorously that they were independent entities.
no comment.
Excuse me?
No comment.
No comment. Well, you'll comment if I interview them, aren't you? Any other questions? Yes.
In your sort of ancient mid or early 1800s, have you run into any competition from the proposed cross Pennsylvania canal between Altoona and Johnstown?
Not competition, but I know the waterway you're talking about. It's mentioned prominently in a book by a man named Carter Goodrich on North American canals. I forget the exact reference, but it should be here in my footnotes.
I had just assumed that died as soon as the Erie Canal was finished.
Well, a lot of those waterways did. You know, there's one that runs across the Tug Hill Plateau.
Yeah.
It's a long, long thing. I just happened to stumble on it one day. You drive along that thing for miles. How anyone ever could conceive that could ever be a moneymaker, you know, is hard to believe. Carter Goodrich, Government Promotion of American Canals and Railroads, 1800 to 1890. 1960 Columbia University Press book, Carter Goodrich. He discusses that canal.
Thank you.
Maybe it's the Black River Canal? Is that what
Yeah.
comes up? Sure.
Yeah.
That's part of it, yeah.
Through Boonville.
Yeah, down through Boonville.
That was a feeder canal in parts.
Well, it's hardly any wider than the distance between you and me here this evening. No, it's
I know the canal, but it put water into your canal.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay. I guess this was not just blowing smoke, that there were serious water problems in that stretch between Syracuse and Rome.
It's like the Glens Falls Canal that puts water out of the Hudson River into the Champlain Canal.
They complained very bitterly about the cutover forests in the Adirondacks, and that led to the shortage of water, presumably, coming into the Erie Canal system, and that's well documented.
This area has had more problems with high water than low water. That's another. I'm paper I'm giving this summer is concerned, partly at least, with the flood conditions of the early 1970s and the attempts to regulate the Richelieu to control flooding. But sufficient water for a canal was never mentioned by anyone as a problem.
Well, this was the other drainage that went down to the Erie.
Yes.
In your paper, you made reference to a potential role of the canal during the Civil War in transportation of troops. Would you repeat that or elaborate on that?
Well, this was a resolution passed by the New York State Legislature. And it put forward the prospect that we would want to have the capacity to put warships into the St. Lawrence from Lake Champlain. It was of interest to me because it wasn't very many years before that people in this area were concerned that the British would have the capacity to do it the other way around, and that's what I meant by the domestic technology story. I think myself that the war, that resolution was passed in 1862, that the war was seized upon as a way to get public funds to build a project. You know, we will do things. How many people got history PhDs in the 1960s under the National Defense Education Act? I did not, but a lot of my friends did. That we will do things in the name of defense that even today they wouldn't dream of doing in other circumstances. So that's my own interpretation of what New York was up to use the Civil War as an acceptable justification for getting federal funding for a project that wouldn't be funded otherwise. But remember also, and I'm glad you asked that question, that our relations with the British suddenly nosedived during the Civil War because of their diplomatic games with the South and the Alabama claims issue, and there are a number. So that while British-American relations were on a steady upward course through the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, they did take a nosedive in the Civil War and then resume the path that they've been really on ever since.
The War Department had contingency grants for war with Britain until 1930.
Sure. That's great. They probably still have them. They just not
Everybody.
Yeah.
Did you mention anything about Fort Blunder or Fort Montgomery?
That I never came into, I never encountered any reference that linked the two in any way to the canal and Fort Montgomery. It's sort of curious that it never happened. You'd think somewhere in these documents someone would make a reference, but I personally have not encountered anything that links the two.
There's no way to get from the Connecticut River to anywhere? Sounds like a launch story, doesn't it? Going north from the Connecticut River?
No, I don't think so. For one thing, the Connecticut River goes north and then loops around a little bit. It's not even like the what's the river that Benedict Arnold used in
Dead River, Chaudier.
Yeah, so I mean, there's not even that kind of near proximity where you could carry things. I think the Connecticut River loops around and comes back south at the very end. I mean, it doesn't really come south, but it makes this sort of.
But it goes
Makes a hook.
too far east
Yeah.
compared to where the centers of population,
doesn't
the
just-
economic centers were in Canada. Also, the Connecticut River has a lot more, was not as navigable. It would take a lot more work to pass the various rapids and
You mentioned that the Corps said that the serve the Canadian interests better than the American interests. It makes one wonder why some Canadian interests didn't get together and build their part of that canal there to help themselves along there.
Well, my explanation is that they were traumatized by their narrow escape in the War of 1812. I mean, they did score victories over the U.S., but they probably shouldn't have. We helped them a lot by our incompetence. I think they only had so much in the way of resource, and they poured it all into the Welland Canal and the Rideau.
No capital left.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you all.
stay for some juice and cookies.